There's a paradox at the heart of capitalism. So capitalism is based on incentives. It's based on supply and demand. It's based on windfall profits, leading towards innovations and ways to make things cheaper. And yet capitalist firms are like mini Soviet-style command economies. You've got a senior central planner at the top, the CEO, and you've got a hierarchical army of bureaucrats underneath them, aka middle management. And then finally, underneath this huge bureaucracy, you've got the workers who actually do the work. But the workers are not responding to incentives. They're just given orders and told what to do. So if you're a computer programmer, you aren't paid based on how much code you write or how many bugs you fix. You're just given a salary regardless of what you do. So why would capitalism evolve this structure where these Soviet-style command economies are the major workhorses? Another way of thinking about it is that capitalist firms are exactly like the Chinese communes that we saw back in Populist Conservatism number 3. So when China went communist, one of the first things they did was nationalize all the farms, and then they forced the peasants to work the fields collectively. And it turned out to be a huge failure. The farms were so incredibly unproductive that the people were forced to resort to cannibalism. And in fact, they would actually trade children with neighboring families so they wouldn't have to eat their own dead children in order to survive. So why did these Chinese communes fail? It's for the exact same reason that we saw back in Populist Conservatism number 8 on Nash equilibriums and the tragedy of the commons. So let's run through it again, because you can never have too much practice thinking out a Nash equilibrium. Suppose there are 5,000 workers in the commune and they all get an equal share of the harvest. And so each worker can make a choice to cooperate or defect. To cooperate means to work hard, and to defect means to shirk on the job. And let's think about this choice through the lens of a particular worker. Let's call her Alicia. So Alicia can either cooperate or defect. Suppose she assumes that everybody else is going to work really hard. Then there's going to be a great harvest, there's going to be a lot of food, so she might as well as shirk. This amazing harvest is only going to be 1 part of 5,000 less great if she herself doesn't work. So she would choose to shirk on the job and free ride on the efforts that everybody else made. So her best, most rational option is to defect. But now suppose she assumes that everybody else shirks. Then the harvest is going to be a horrible failure and everyone's going to be starving no matter what she does. She can't single-handedly turn this around. So she would have to be the world's biggest sucker to be the only person working hard when everyone else is shirking. So just like the tragedy of the commons, the Chinese communes have a single Nash equilibrium of always defect. Now, the way the Chinese communists solved this is that the villagers actually all got together in secret and they went back to capitalism in secret. Everybody got a private lot and they all farmed their own private lot individually instead of farming all the land collectively. So private property in capitalism solved the problems of communism. But as we saw in that video, Populist Conservatism number 8, not everything can be divided into privately owned lots. So a lot of environmental problems happen that way. We can't divide the atmosphere into privately owned lots. If we did, it would save a lot of problems. If everybody drove around with their own personal air supply, we wouldn't have to have environmental laws that make their cars low emissions, because no one would want to run a dirty exhaust into their own private air supply. And capitalist firms are another example of something that can't be divided into privately owned lots. And that's the main lesson of Populist Conservatism number 5 about monopolies and economies of scale in particular. So on page 1 of chapter 1 of Adam Smith's legendary book, The Wealth of Nations, he describes the productivity increase that happens when workers who make pins used assembly lines. Now by hand, each worker could only make about 20 pins per day. But if they all worked in stages on an assembly line, the output per worker rose to about 5,000 pins. The problem was this took about 20 workers all together, each working on a different stage. So now you've got economies of scale created. You need 20 workers working collectively on the same project. And so that's the reason for this sort of paradox at the heart of modern capitalist economies. In order to take advantage of economies of scale, firms have to have large numbers of workers all collectively working on the same task. And therefore, firms are an awful lot like the Chinese communes. And that raises the puzzle that's really at the heart of this video series, which is this. Why are capitalist firms like SpaceX and Microsoft so successful, but the Chinese communes failed so badly that the people were forced to resort to cannibalism? The issue is that rural China, like most of the world, is organized by dense kinship networks. And that makes it easy to cooperate within the extended family, but it makes it hard to cooperate outside of the extended family. And these Chinese communes required people to cooperate with other extended families, and that's what people in China were less willing to do. However, even in high-trust societies in the developed world, you can't just take for granted the idea that people will work cooperatively as part of a larger group. There's a lot of lemons, there's a lot of free riders, and so creating a healthy workplace culture is extremely difficult. You may have a workplace culture that's pretty hardworking, but some new employees who are hired are lemons and don't put in their fair share and are free riding on the rest of the group, and that underroads the morale and the effort and the esprit de corps, and the entire firm starts to slack off until the firm goes out of business. So now, let's switch gears a little bit and look at some of the ways that firms have tried to solve this problem by incentivizing their workers. And I'll be leaning very heavily on a review article by the economist Canis Prendergast, and his article is The Provision of Incentive in Firms. It's a fantastic article. It's not technical, it's not filled with mathematics, so I would highly recommend checking it out, but I will hit the highlights. So the obvious solution is to pay everyone a piece rate. If the assembly line produces 100 widgets in a day, each worker gets paid $100. If the assembly line produces 200 widgets in a day, then each worker gets paid $200. The main problem with this is what's called the Ratchet Effect. Employees aren't dumb. They know that management can't always be trusted, and management may try to screw them over by lowering the piece rate at some point in the future. Suppose the assembly line starts out making 200 widgets a day, and management establishes that as what a hardworking team can do, and then they cut the piece rate so that they're only getting half what they used to. But now they say, hey, you've shown that you can make 200 widgets a day, we expect that level to continue. This actually happened to my mother-in-law, who used to work for a major medical supply company, and she sold x-ray machines. And she had a commission of $1,500 for each machine that she sold. This was 20 years ago. She's been retired for a while now. So she's very charming, she's very smart, knows how to sell. So although she had an informal quota of selling 12 machines per year, she soon was selling 30, 40, even 60 machines per year. And so what happened was that her firm started cutting her commission. So they dropped it to $1,100 per machine, then to $800 per machine, then to $800 per hospital. It didn't matter if the hospital bought 1 x-ray machine or 10 x-ray machines, she still only got $800. So that's the ratchet effect. And employees aren't dumb, and they know that management may try and pull something like this. So employees defend against this by setting norms of low workplace effort. And a very comical and funny example of this is in the movie Big, starring Tom Hanks. In the movie, Tom Hanks' character gets a job working in computers, and almost as soon as he starts, the next employee over, who is played by the comedian John Lovitz, starts scolding him for working too fast, and he accuses him of trying to get everyone fired. And so what you see is a new employee being initiated into the norm of a low work output. Now, the ratchet effect can be solved, but it takes trust between workers and management. The Lincoln Electric Company was able to use a piece rate payment system for their workers for over 100 years, but that only worked because they developed a reputation for never lowering the piece rate and never laying off workers. So the workers could safely work hard without fear that their efforts would be punished. And this needs to be stressed because it's such a rare thing in modern times. That only happened because workers and management could mutually trust each other. The other problem with relying on incentives is what's called multitasking. And this does not mean browsing social media while watching TV. So Prendergast explains with the story of Ken O'Brien, who was a football quarterback in the early 1980s. He was prone to throwing interceptions, so his team gave him a new contract that penalized him for each interception that he threw. And it worked. He threw a lot fewer interceptions. But the problem was that he didn't throw as many passes at all. He would just hold on to the ball out of fear of making an interception. So the football great Joe Namath, who knows a lot more about motivating people than most management consultants, said, "I see him hold on to the ball more than he should. I don't like incentive contracts that pertain to numbers." So that's multitasking. If you have a contract with some incentives built in, workers will usually do better at whatever the incentives measure, but they will shift their efforts away from other things that aren't measured. The economist James Courtney has a great example of this in his book Common Sense Economics. In the former Soviet Union, managers and employees of glass plants were at one time rewarded according to how many tons of sheet glass they produced. Because their revenues depended on the weight of the glass, most factories produced sheet glass so thick you could hardly see through it. The rules were changed so that managers were compensated according to the number of square meters of glass they produced. Under these rules, Soviet firms made glass so thin that it broke easily. And if you think only the Soviet Union would come up with such terrible incentives, well, here's some examples from America. In New York, surgeons were penalized if their mortality rates were too high. So research by Andrew Leventis finds that surgeons stop taking on high-risk patients if they get too close to their threshold. So surgeons do better at what's being measured, their mortality rates, but the expense comes at the overall level of care. The sickest patients who need the best surgeons are the ones that suffer. Robert Drago and Gerald Garvey use Australian survey data to show that pay-for-performance incentive schemes result in employees helping their coworkers less often. So workers do better at what is being measured, their own performance, at the expense of things that are not measured, the overall team performance. And one of the most horrifying examples in Prendergast's survey is that IBM used to pay their programmers according to the number of lines of code they wrote each day, which resulted in heavily bloated, hard-to-read code. Now, the obvious solution is to create a rubric that scores quality on a whole bunch of different dimensions. But even that has a problem. So whenever you turn two numbers into one number, you have to make a subjective judgment call about how to do that. So for example, suppose you wanted to create a rating for sports cars, and so you rated them based on how good their handling is and how good their acceleration is. Now, to turn that into a single number to rate a sports car, you have to do something. So you could average them together and have it be 50% each, but if one person wants a smooth European roadster and another person wants a classic American muscle car, those numbers are completely useless for both of them. And this is exactly the point that Malcolm Gladwell made in his article, The Order of Things. What he did is he looked at car and drivers' ratings for the best sports car, and their ratings showed that the Porsche Cayman was allegedly the best sports car. But Gladwell showed that by changing how much to weight each rating, like acceleration and looks and different items, that he could make a different car, like the Lotus Elise or the Chevy Corvette, have the highest rating. Now, if you're a skeptically minded listener, you might be thinking that there's got to be an objective method to find the best car, and in certain very narrow contexts there probably is. I'll bet in Formula One that teams know exactly how much money to spend on aerodynamics versus acceleration versus handling versus braking to design cars. But they have a whole bunch of advantages. Most importantly, they have an objective standard for success. The fastest car around the racetrack wins. Secondly, they have computer-enabled cars that generate enormous amounts of hard data and armies of engineers that can go and analyze this data. But in most fields, you simply can't do this. Take Malcolm Gladwell as an example. Which Malcolm Gladwell book is the best? There is no objective rating. You could use something like average critics review or number of sales, but that's not going to give you the best. It might give you the most popular. But even critics' reviews are ultimately subjective. Another problem is that rating people invariably requires creating a threshold. So a score of 90% or higher gets you a good rating, and anything below that gets you a bad rating. And so that means if you're judging employees on this sort of complex, multi-dimensional rubric for quality, then maybe one or two ticky-tacky items ding you enough so that you don't get your 90% or higher. Think about your own job. If there were some sort of an audit process and you had a 20-question questionnaire designed to audit how well you do on your job, that's not really going to capture the full scope and importance of what you actually do. The belief that worker quality could be accurately measured was almost enough to single-handedly destroy the American auto industry. For a long time, the prevailing philosophy for how to run a factory was based on the ideas of Frederick Winslow Taylor. He was an engineer who created the management philosophy of Taylorism, and he felt that each worker on an assembly line should have a simple, well-defined task that he did repeatedly. This would maximize performance and allow worker quality to be accurately measured. So for example, he might tell someone who is working on a railroad the exact sequence of steps to take from the pile of coal to the boiler. So grab the shovel like this, get one shovelful, take this exact sequence of steps in this exact way, and then put the coal into the boiler of the railroad steam engine. This one-size-fits-all approach dovetails exactly into what the left was doing. This was during the progressive era of the early 20th century, and the left was all in on scientific management. And to them, scientific management meant mapping out every single step that someone who worked the steam engine in a train would take. They didn't make allowances if one person was taller than another, or shorter than another, or had a limp, or was left-handed. And they also didn't take into account the fact that following the exact same sequence all day long over and over again would almost certainly lead to repetitive stress injuries. Slightly varying how you change your steps, how you grip the shovel, those can distribute the load more equally across your entire body and keep your output higher and your health higher. But again, the scientific management did not appreciate this concept. It's the fallacy of Chesterton's fence all the way down with leftists. And this time I'm not going to go in the tangent of Chesterton's fence, so see Populist Conservatism number 1. So here's how Taylorism played out in the auto industry. A job might be rivet door panel A to door panel B. So that's a simple, well-defined job, and it's easy to measure worker performance. But it has a problem. Suppose door panel A wasn't shaped quite right, perhaps because of a mistake that an upstream worker made. Then the riveter wouldn't be able to make it fit door panel B, so he'd do the best that he could and then send it down the line. These small errors could actually snowball, and perhaps by the end of the assembly line the door wouldn't even close because of all these fitting problems. So assembly lines based on Taylorism have poor quality, and you have to do a lot of refitting work. And refitting work is just a fancy term for paying mechanics to fix brand new cars that have never been driven. And we just generally accepted that this was the state of the art and the best that you could do with assembly lines until the rise of Japanese manufacturing firms in the 1980s. So firms like Toyota and Sony were basically the Apple and Microsoft of the 1980s. And it took another engineer-turned-management consultant to explain the problem with Taylorism. So the engineer, James Womack, spent 5 years studying Toyota, which was one of the best-run companies in the world, and he changed manufacturing forever when he released his book about how Toyota did it. He called it The Machine That Changed the World, The Story of Lean Production. He released this book in 1990, and it explained the major principles of lean manufacturing, or just-in-time manufacturing. So, lean manufacturing arose after World War II, and Japan was very impoverished because of the war, so they did not have the luxury of extensive reserves of spare parts. So they adopted lean manufacturing out of necessity. And the idea is you put employees in teams with flexible job descriptions. So if door panel A wasn't shaped quite right, one worker would jump in and fix it on the spot, and another worker would take over the riveting as the next part came down the assembly line. Now they did this, again, because they didn't have the luxury of extensive reserves of spare parts, so they couldn't rely on doing a ton of refitting work after their cars had gone down the line. Instead, they had to come up with a system that avoided the need for refitting work in the first place. And so this had two important consequences. The first is that it's actually higher in quality. If you don't need to do a lot of refitting work, then you're just having a higher quality assembly line where everything just fits better, is better connected, and better assembled in the first place. Remember, with refitting work, you take the worst problems and you fix it, but if everything is kind of sloppily connected and sloppily done, but still more or less works, you just let that slide. So lean manufacturing just results in inherently higher quality builds. And it's the second consequence that interests us here, which is that you can no longer objectively evaluate the job that one worker does. So lean manufacturing requires workers to work in teams, and they're fluidly switching between tasks, whereas with Taylorism, each worker has a single task that they do repeatedly. So attempts to objectively measure worker quality have all consistently failed. They all run afoul of the law of unintended consequences in some way or another. And so that takes us to managers, and managers are a step in the right direction. So managers do develop subjective opinions about the quality of their workers, and those opinions are usually pretty accurate. And that's why every single capitalist firm has a hierarchy of managers working in it. However, managers are not a magic bullet, and managers do introduce their own issues. The first problem with managers is that they have a conflict of interest. So managers may exchange good reviews for loyalty. A study of Navy supervisors showed that they distorted performance reviews in order to help their favorite subordinates move up the ladder. And in this way, they were able to develop a small army of loyal subordinates that he had personally groomed and developed. And if you want an example of that from pop culture, you see it in The Devil Wears Prada. So the character Miranda Priestley was editor-in-chief of a fashion magazine, and her boss wanted to fire her and replace her with another woman who could produce a similar product for much less money. However, Miranda could not be fired because she had, quote, the list. And the list was a list of models, designers, editors, and photographers whose careers she had advanced and who were personally loyal to her, not the magazine. So if she was fired, she would go to some other rival magazine and everyone on that list would go with her. The second problem is that managers want to look good to their own bosses. So unpopular managers risk having their employees stir up trouble in a variety of ways. So they may go and file complaints with HR, or they may go behind their boss's back and complain directly to their boss's boss. And their boss's boss would probably ignore one or even two such complaints, but if a whole bunch of employees started doing it, then the boss's boss would start to get suspicious. Or the employees may simply rebel, and they may just become demoralized and intentionally cut their own work efforts and establish new and lower norms of standard work output, a bit like the example that we saw from the movie Big a little bit earlier in this video. So you can think about managers as having two distinct and contradictory jobs. The first job is the most important, which is keeping their team as a whole happy, motivated, and hardworking. And the second job works against it, which is to individually evaluate the qualities of their employees and reward the good employees while punishing the bad employees. And the empirical research confirms this. So there's two main ways that managers do this. The first is called leniency bias, which is where they tend to give everybody good reviews. And the second is centrality bias, which happens when the good employees are rated as being only slightly better than average, and the bad employees are rated as only being slightly worse than average. So by compressing everyone's ratings, they're basically giving everyone the same grade and keeping their team happy. A study by the economist David Card and his colleagues confirmed these difficulties. They found, shockingly, that employees are very unhappy when they get below average reviews and pay increases. And then these employees start to stir up trouble and cause complaints, and it also leads to turnover. And realize this, if you are being accurate about performance reviews, then half your employees have to be below average. Even at Microsoft or SpaceX, where you're looking at a very elite pool of applicants to begin with, half your employees have to be below average. So if you're going to punish half your employees with bad performance reviews, then you're going to get high turnover and very low workplace morale. Even if someone is rated as above average in a performance review, you never know what's going to happen next year. Maybe they're working on an important project and that project happens to fail. So every employee is going to live in fear, and you're going to make this employee evaluation process extremely high stakes, and it's going to create a very combative atmosphere between managers and employees. And so refer that back to the lesson of the Lincoln Electric Company. They were able to get very high worker output, but they could only do that because they had a lot of trust between workers and management, and a very high-stakes performance review erodes that trust between workers and management. Managers are a fantastic solution for small businesses where the owner is the manager. So the dual role of owner and manager eliminates this conflict of interest. So remember, managers want to keep their team happy, but owners want to make as much profit as possible. So that dual role means that you have a very strong incentive to keep your workers happy, but you're also not going to ignore or smooth over genuine problems. But even small businesses have their problems. One of the TV shows that my wife got me into is called Tabitha's Salon Takeover, and it's basically Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, but for salons. However, I actually like it better than Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, and the reason why is because good food can cover up a lot of management sins. Restaurants really live or die by their food, so turning around a restaurant really means improving their food, not so much improving their workplace culture. Whereas for Tabitha's Salon Takeover, it really was about reforming the workplace culture. And if you watch the show enough, you start to see the exact same pattern of failures over and over again. So one pattern is the absentee owner. A lot of people start a small business not because they want to be their own boss, but because they don't even want to work in the first place. So they hire a manager to run the business that they started, and they watch TV all day and live on the profits. Except that the manager is not an owner. The manager doesn't have any incentive to work hard. The manager doesn't have any incentive to make the store profitable. So not surprisingly, the managers tend to slack off. And that's a very important problem, and it's one that we'll continue to see throughout the rest of this video. Managers are not a magic bullet in a vacuum. Managers themselves need an incentive to do a good job. So if the manager is an owner, they've got a great incentive. The better a job they do as a manager, the higher their profits as an owner. But if they're not an owner, they've got no incentive and consequently do a bad job. Another problem is owners who have poor social skills. So there's a human side to running a successful business. Managers that are too tough alienate their employees and lower workplace morale, which results in both high turnover and poor effort. But managers who are too soft get walked all over. They can't enforce discipline and they can't run a tight ship. So good managers have to strike a balance of professionalism, but they also have to genuinely care about the welfare of their workers. If they don't genuinely care about their workers, the workers aren't going to feel attached to the business and to their team. It's very easy to ruin a workplace culture, but it's very hard to rebuild it. However, because the incentives of having an owner/manager are so powerful, this model usually does work pretty well for small businesses. The problem is that it can't scale. So to some extent you can scale by getting more owners. So maybe 2 or 3 friends or 2 or 3 brothers all go into business together. And then they each do a shift as manager. And that allows you to scale the business a little bit. But you can't make every single manager a part owner in the business. So at some point you run into a scaling problem. And this also explains why low trust societies, which is to say virtually every nation in the developing world, has problems developing large firms. You don't get Microsoft and SpaceX in the developing world, even though they have large numbers of educated citizens. It also explains why incompetent relatives are often put into positions of authority in these low-trust societies. And it makes more sense to have an incompetent relative that you can trust than a competent stranger that you can't trust. But the incompetent but trustworthy nephew theory of management is never going to build a firm that can go toe-to-toe with Microsoft or SpaceX. So the reality is, if you want large firms that can create massive economies of scale, then you need managers who are not owners. And that creates the exact same problem that we saw in Tabitha's salon takeover with the absentee owner. Who will manage the managers? Who will punish managers who are shirking on the job or who are ineffective at creating a healthy workplace culture? So large corporations solve this problem by creating an entire hierarchy of managers with CEOs and senior managers at the top. And then the CEOs and senior managers get stock options, which make them a lot like owners. And that solution is the best we've got, but it creates some major problems. So here's a good way to think about firms. There is a line in the sand between making money and losing money. Free market competition will weed out any firm that consistently loses money. So when a firm sinks into unprofitability, the alarm bells go off. New leadership is brought in, divisions are reorganized, money-losing departments are spun off, and management's favorite pet projects are finally canceled. Unfortunately, there's no line in the sand between being a healthy and well-run firm that makes a 20% profit and a somewhat dysfunctional firm that makes a 4% profit. So there's a lot of slack between 20% profit and 4% profit. And there are 3 special interest groups fighting to take a hold of that slack. First is the shareholders, second is the CEO and senior management, and third is the regular workers. First, let's look at the CEOs and senior management. They want the firm to make the highest profits possible because that would maximize the value of their stock options. And the stock options are where they make their real money, not their actual salary. And so you would think that this very neatly harmonizes CEOs and senior managements with the good of the firm, but that is not the case. Stock options typically vest over 4 years, and CEOs and senior management usually only stick around for 5 or 10 years. So what they do is what economists call short-termism. They steer the firm to make short-term profits at the expense of long-term profits. One way to do this is with techniques that fall under the category of earnings management, like income smoothing, deferring expenses, and cutting research and development so that they can meet quarterly profit targets. But the best ways to do it are actually more subtle. You can think of a CEO as choosing 2 different strategies. They can create a low turnover, high cohesion workforce, but it costs about 10 or 15% more for labor costs, but that will maximize profits over, say, a 10 to 20 year horizon. Or they could have a short-term, high-turnover, less cohesive workforce, and that'll cut their labor costs by 10 or 15%. So in the next 5 years, over the window that their options will invest, that's what will produce the most profitable firm. And so management, given the way their stock options work, are incentivized to choose the short-term option. They create uncohesive, high-turnover workforces with somewhat lower labor costs. The second group is the shareholders. So they obviously want high profits, but there's been a little bit of an economic debate over whether shareholders themselves are pressuring firms for short-term profits or if shareholders want long-term profits. So they might want short-term profits so that they can essentially flip their stock. And if that's the case, we should insulate management from shareholder pressure. Alternately, if they want long-term profits, then we should actually create structures so that shareholders can more effectively pressure senior management. And I think the best research here is done by an economist, Lucian Bebchuk, and his research shows that shareholders are aligned with the long-term health of the firm. And by contrast, he has also shown that these incentives we give to CEOs and senior managers, such as options that invest in 4 years, creates incentives for short-termism. So if you want to know why management keeps doing dumb things that seem to hurt the quality of their product and that can cause some degree of very real psychic distress to people who work there, knowing that the latest fad that management is up to is only going to make things worse, this is exactly why. Management is behaving rationally in their own self-interest. They're just not behaving in the firm's interest. And the third special interest group is the workers, and they're probably the most complicated. The way you can think about workers is that there's this low-level battle going on between workers who are peaches and workers who are lemons. Workers who are lemons want to set norms of low workplace effort, and workers who are peaches want to set higher norms of workplace effort, at least if they're in a good situation where they can trust management. So if management is clearly biasing the firm's overall quality for short-term profits, then the peaches kind of lose their leverage and the lemons start to gain it, and the lemons can assert their power and set lower norms of workplace effort. But if management is really being very responsive to workers' needs and really cultivating a culture of excellence, then the peaches start to get the upper hand and the peaches can start to set norms of high workplace effort. And that's what you see at firms that can cultivate a real sense of esprit de corps. I once went and worked for a startup, and it really had this sense of esprit de corps going, and it was more work than I was used to doing. I always thought of myself as a pretty hard worker until I got to this firm and I realized I had to raise my game a little bit. And over the years that I was there, I definitely did learn to raise my game. But then they got bought, and after they got bought, they started undermining the company that they had purchased. It's the oldest story in business, really. Management sees something juicy in another firm, but they don't really understand what's involved in making that firm become such a juicy target in the first place. So they start systematically eroding the morale with cost-cutting and other problems. And when that happens, the lemons start to take over and the workplace norms steer towards lower and lower work effort. And so now that you understand these three special interest groups, let's take a look at the who will monitor the monitors problem. So in theory, the CEO must answer to a board of directors and to the shareholders, but membership on a board of directors is a bit like joining a cabal. So many of the board members are either CEOs or senior managers, and they have the same exact management philosophy and culture. So they use their power to set norms of high CEO pay and low standards of accountability that promote short-termism. So did the firm do well? Stock options. Did the firm do poorly? Golden parachute. Either way, it's a win-win for CEOs. Non-CEO board members may use their membership on the board to trade power and influence with the CEO board members. And even when you have a genuine outsider, what that means is you don't have this objective outside voice. Instead, you've got someone with essentially no deep industry knowledge. So they can be bullied into agreement by better informed board members, even if those board members are acting in their own short-term self-interest rather than the long-term interests of the shareholders. And I'd be willing to bet you've seen this dynamic play out by people in your own workforce. Maybe you've got a manager who's a pushover, and you've got some guy who's smart and competent, but also maybe a little bit lazy, and when management comes to him wanting to know why the project's not completed yet, then he can do a very convincing job of creating all these excuses about all these problems that are going on with it, and management doesn't actually know enough about the low-lying processes to challenge him. An even bigger problem with boards is that most board members are lazy. So the activist investor Nell Minow, whose career is basically buying up majority control in firms that are poorly managed, he noted that some big names on boards barely show up due to other commitments, and when they show, they're not prepared. So activist investors are a potential solution to this problem. So what they can do is buy enough shares to grant themselves majority voting control, take over the board, oust the CEO and senior management, and institute better management. Economists call this the market for corporate control. The problem is that the market is rigged against activist investors. So one way that happens is poison pills built into how stocks must be bought that make it expensive for investors to gain a majority stake in a firm. Another line of defense is anti-hostile takeover laws such as the Williams Act of 1968, and it includes disclosure requirements that prevent activist investors from covertly buying up stock until such a time as they reach majority voting control. You might be wondering, how on earth do we have laws that protect bad management? Of all the people in the world that need to be protected, how exactly did managers who want to ruin firms for short-term interests somehow shoot up to the top of the list above orphans and baby seals? And the answer is that when activist investors take control of a firm, they don't just replace the CEO and senior management. They also do all these other maneuvers that should have been done a long time ago, like spin off unprofitable divisions, and that often results in layoffs and downsizing. Now, this is a necessary process. That was the entire theme of Populist Conservatism number 3 on creative destruction. But it is a traumatic process. There's no getting around the trauma of it, and I tried to emphasize that while creative destruction is necessary, it does come with a lot of trauma. It causes a lot of job losses. It causes a lot of genuine hardship for people. But it is necessary. If we didn't have the process of creative destruction, we'd still be stuck in the world with the technology of, 1000 BC or some such. So you have to go through the process if you want to live in a world of technological change and rising wealth. That's just the price that you have to pay. But it makes hostile takeovers a very easy target for leftists. And so they can create all these anti-hostile takeover laws to protect firms. And what you get is leftists who are trying to stick up for workers actually sticking up for CEOs and senior management, which is a very common problem, and we'll see that more when we get to public choice theory, which is what happens when we apply an economic analysis to the government. And what you'll see is a lot of progressive leftist movements actually end up making the rich a lot more powerful. So let's wrap this all up now. The main problem is that capitalist firms are just like the Chinese commune. They have a single Nash equilibrium of always shirk on the job. And the best defense against this is the work ethic. The more peaches you've got and the fewer lemons, the better chance you have of establishing norms of high workplace effort. Management can also play a role, but management suffers from the who will manage the managers problem. And as we've seen, the answer to that question is usually no one. So it's up to the work ethic of the individual workers and the broader national culture to take up the slack. And this is also the primary reason why some nations and cultures are wealthy and other nations and cultures are poor and corrupt. It's probably the single most conservative lesson in all of politics, which is that it's all culture. It's all about culture. As the great Democrat Daniel Patrick Moynihan once put it, the central conservative truth is that culture, and not politics, is what determines the success of a nation. And I'll have a couple videos further down the series about specifically work ethic, Nash equilibriums, and economic development. So, this video has been about how hard it is to have a successful and efficient firm that doesn't collapse under the pressures of lemons and free riders and special interest groups devouring the gains that the firm makes. But if you think firms are tough to make successful, wait till you take a look at government. And that's what the next video is going to be about. We're going to apply an economic analysis to the incentives of government, which is what the economic discipline of public choice theory does.